Let's just start. What do you think so far? Casey had her hand up. What do you want to say? Thumbs up. Mess button in the last one. Thumbs up. Thumbs down.
It's really different.
Very different. Why? Who said that? Agnes. Why?
I think it's just designed really differently to begin with. Obviously there's a difference in the characters. There are two detectives that are kind of interrelated.
Okay. So a couple observations about difference in design structure of the novel. Two detectives that makes a difference, right? Because then you can have dialogue between the two detectives. Although Lathan goes for that a little bit with Kallio and Koivu, right? But these are more older kids. I guess here we have a younger detective and an older detective, but there's maybe more philosophical bent here. There's a couple chapters that are really philosophically oriented, you could say. Kirtan?
I found it interesting on cover art, we kind of get only the main character's perspective, but in this one we get perspective from a lot of different characters.
Okay, there's that multi-perspectival dimension. And so one thing to ask yourself then is, it is a police procedural in as much as it's about a professional investigation of a crime. We have the tech people and the autopsy and these kinds of things. But also in these perspectival shifts, the narrative structure of the novel, or the narration, right, which just means how the story is told. In that part of the novel, these different perspectives, right, they add they add tension. That would be what I would say. But you can ask yourself, what do those do? What's the point of those multiple perspectives? The reason I said it was adds tension is because I was thinking of Todorov, right? This is what he means when he talks about a thriller. He said, we get a perspective from the perpetrator. Is he going to do it again? Right? There's that race against time aspect that becomes a part of it. Now, is that what the novel does with it? Is another question. But just structurally, you can make that argument, like thinking of Todorov. But actually, I want to just ask you, take a second to talk. What do you think is going on with the multiple perspectives in the narration? Kirtan's point. Let's just take that, talk about it amongst yourselves for a second, and then we'll hear what people have to say with the whole class.
Where you feel like, so I think that's what I'm trying to character. So that much does that like cops like the killer. Because I don't want to spoil it, but I've seen it from going farther. I've seen like this episode's like questions to get ready. Especially this one detective, he's just like he's like trying to be almost like detective, and he's just like, man, like, you don't just get well. There's like something that happened, and so I feel that's what it is. Like, I think it's just he's trying to be different. It's like when you look at it from like compliment, anything really good to see from this perspective, you're like, as soon as you saw the bad guy, you're just like, the bad guy, like, you're bad. Like here, I am a pleasant. This guy, I feel like I've seen from this guy's perspective, and like you see how he thinks, like, what am I doing? Knowing the
Okay, let's turn back to the class. The question was, what these multiple perspectives? Why? What would you argue? Elizabeth, thank you.
We thought that by having the killer's perspective, it really almost humanizes him a little bit more, especially when the crime is killing a kid.
Yeah.
Adding that human aspect to the killer kind of creates even more of a tension.
Okay, so we get the perspective. We get the killer's perspective, which does it create sympathy for him? I mean, how does it humanize?
It doesn't necessarily create sympathy, but it just makes you realize, oh, this is an actual person.
Right. Okay.
And there was one chapter where he was like, "What did I do?" Or he just was freaking out. So it just kind of, you don't sympathize with him, but you just realize he's not just some totally completely awful.
Right. It's not like oftentimes our criminals in American crime fiction or film are pathological cases, right? They are evil and they should be snubbed out, right? That's the analysis we're offered. And this is a much different kind of thing. I think that's part of, to come back to that social critical discussion we were having before the break, that's one of the things Scandinavian crime fiction tries to offer. It wants to develop a more nuanced picture of crime and its perpetrators. Cassie. You're Cassie.
Yes.
That's how you keep getting confused.
So I think the multiple perspectives question because of the way the book is laid out. So you get the crime right at the start.
Okay.
And so you have to have multiple perspectives because no one character stories you know everything that happens, you know what's going on. Because you don't get that background, you start off with the story and tell the story and all that.
Okay, so it's an argument in that way for omniscience, right? What's omniscience? What's omniscient narration? The omniscient narration is when the narrator knows everything, and that can be, you think if you've read any literature or history of literature at all, it's a very typical 19th century style. Usually, they say the modernist novel, which is from the mid 20th century. There's a limited perspective, and it's most famous, right, for stream of consciousness narration, where we're like right in one character's head, and all we see is their perspective. Here we're back to kind of omniscience, but it's kind of doing it in a tricky way because it's putting that omniscience across a bunch of different characters. So we really have the whole picture, but it's not in the narrator's head, right? It's across the different heads of these characters. So it's a kind of a clever way, you could say, to make it both an omniscient novel and a novel of limited perspectives. Yeah, Elizabeth. Sorry. Caitlin, sorry.
Well, and it also basically gives a chance to get to look at multiple people's interior views of what's going on, of the crime that's been committed. So you get things that would seem kind of clunky to have discussed in dialogue.
Yeah.
In interior monologue instead, so you actually get to learn a little bit more about, especially in terms of social criticism.
Yeah.
Going on, you get the kind of things
Right.
that people don't normally that it would seem strange to have
Right.
people just go around and randomly talk.
You can think about two realities in this classroom right now. What's the dialogue we're having? You can record it, and I am recording it, and you can look at it and say what happened in this class. Look at that. And then we can have kind of this novels technique of what's going on in the class based on all these interior monologues. God only knows, right? What is going on out there in this classroom? What are people thinking of? But yeah, it's a kind of a way to enrich the account of the social fabric. Yeah.
It creates dramatic irony for the reader. So we know things about all the characters that the detectives don't know, and creates kind of a more anxious reading because you just want them to know what you know. It's more engaging.
Okay, great. Excellent point. Dramatic irony. What's dramatic irony?
It's whether the audience or the reader knows something that the characters don't
Right.
know.
So the audience knows something that the reader doesn't know, so that there's something that's being unsaid, right? Irony always involves something that is left unsaid. But here, the irony is controlled in a sense because we do know something, that, even though something's not being said, we kind of know what it is because some other character has said it or thought it. So the dramatic irony is it creates tension and conflict because the reader knows more than the characters in the story. It's a very effective way to tell a story because it piques the reader's interest at the same time as it's a really strong way of commenting, right? Why don't they know that? How could they know that? Those kinds of questions. Jake.
It kind of allows the book to introduce the characters kind of in small groups rather than throwing a bunch of names at you. I had a little bit of trouble with the last one because the one name was only had two. I remember I was trying to think back and
Okay, who's who?
Yeah. This person who's cheating on you, so
Okay. So here there's a kind of a structural principle as well that it organizes the characters' relationships because you can see them thinking about one another.
Right.
Yeah, so and then that provides a little mental map for the reader.
Sarah. And I thought too with that, it adds to kind of the social criticism, but also, I mean, they go on all these characters, give you all these different perspectives, but no one's having a good day. Like everyone is unhappy in some way or another, and it doesn't necessarily have to do with the other characters, but no one's in a good place.
Okay. So are you saying that it conveys that I'm not getting the point. Okay, so it emphasizes that tone. Okay, I guess right. Getting in characters. This is how I'm going to render or say what you were saying. Characters heads allows us to see the darkness. What should I put? Just like notes here. Darkness. It's very bleak, right? That when you get in there, and part of that is with dialogue, right? As just to reiterate the point I just made before, right? When it's dialogue, we're saying all these things to one another. Are we really feeling them? You know, we may be feeling very different than what we say in dialogue, and that's of course that's part of that dramatic irony. That the irony is that I'm put on this performance. I look like I'm feeling this way, but in reality, like my mind's on this or that, and I feel horrible or whatever. And then you can get that through this kind of interior, giving this interior information. And so the technique here allows for getting into characters' heads and getting that darkness at the same time as it makes it. You can see the broad social perspective. Where you're not just kind of like nailed down to one way of seeing things. Christine?
No matter what part of the crime you're in, either you're the perpetrator, the people investigating, or someone just slightly involved, nobody likes it. We're saying that this kind of abduction, child killing, murder is always bad.
Okay.
So it's setting a tone for the crime and making it 2030.
Okay, so that by the narrative form allows us to see the social criticism. That is, the consequences of a death of this kind, murder of this kind, are huge, and everyone is touched by them. And so it really. The form then allows us to see the uniformity of response across these various perspectives.
Kathleen, another thing is when you have multiple perspectives, you can kind of focus on the crime itself with each person, so you get more of the crime and less of, I sat to saw them all day.
Okay, so crime remains in focus. I'll just put that. Crime remains in focus. So it's not diluted by all this scene setting and moving around and the narration and so forth. So it keeps it pretty concise. Yeah, good point. Austin?
Kind of the opposite, though, is that you miss some of the character development. You don't get to know the characters as well because you spend so much time.
Okay, good. Yeah, there's maybe a problem with character development here because when you move around to a lot of different characters like this and you get in their head, it's hard to, in a way, develop those characters, and so perhaps they remain a little flat in ways. And that would be something here. The other thing is, just to add to that, you can think about the style here, but I would say she likes a really concise style. It doesn't make the characters speak a lot and tries to limit what they say, and then you get this kind of almost like oracular feel, like speaking like an oracle. She's trying to make it sound better than it is by making it come across in a few words, which it's another way to say pretentious, right? Where, so there can be that where you're trying to be super tight, then it can lead to this sort of putting too much pressure on the language. Kaya?
It allows for multiple storylines to finish off the first time.
Yeah, good point. So we get these sort of, should we put, tangential storylines. And that's by tangential I don't mean unimportant, but just that they're not the direct story. Subplots, I'll put it that way. That's a better way to put it. Subplots develop. For example, this Reinhardt and Christina's marriage, right? It's actually at the beginning and it goes through the book, and it's important. It reflects on the crime itself, and yet it's not the main story, right? But you're able to develop that by this multiple perspective. So that's a little bit, it's kind of in tension with Austin's point, but good there. Yeah, Agnes.
I just have a quick question. So in a story like this where there are multiple perspectives, who is the protagonist? Is there a protagonist? I mean, not that there necessarily needs to be one, but who are we supposed to?
Well, how do you answer that question? Anyone, any thoughts? How do you know who the protagonist is? one of the traditional. Oh, go ahead, Jake.
Oh, I was just saying maybe it's based off of the reader. That's kind of who you're rooting for.
Yeah. What are you rooting for them to do?
Depends on whatever their job is.
Yeah. Well, in this case, solve the crime, right? And who's trying to solve the crime here? Sayer, right, and Skara. So they're really, I would argue, it's an objective, it's a goal-based thing that lets us know who the protagonist in this kind of novel, where because they are trying to solve a crime, and the story is the story of an investigation that aims to solve a crime. The answer to your question is, it's Sayer and Skara who are and mostly Sayer who's the main character, the protagonist. So that's just that a novel like this is based on an outcome or trying to solve a problem, and so Sayer is the main one trying to solve the problem, and as a result, he's the main character. If this weren't a crime novel, you could argue that this is like a collective novel, that there is no protagonist. There's multiple perspectives, and it weaves those together, and then that goes much more toward. Remember, I was talking about the modernist novel, which is, we don't need to get into literary aesthetics, but that would be something. It would be a much more literary account. But then you could have that would be much less about the investigation, much more about the response to the death of Jonas August. Elizabeth? No, Emily. Right? Sorry.
Yeah. Well, like I just wanted to say the novel seems more realistic.
Okay.
Multi-character perspectives, because everyone thinks like that like real, not like I don't know. They just seem really real.
Okay, so there's a more realistic feel to the character development because of the multiple perspectives. Okay, let's take another question here. Great responses. Jennifer, did you want to add one more thing?
It's okay.
Okay. One of the places I wanted to begin with was the question in sort of trying to identify themes here. What figurative language did you notice in this novel? Let's just ask, what does figurative language mean? Dramatic irony came up. Dramatic irony is a kind of figurative language, but metaphors, metonymies, speaking in figures, right? So that you're using basically symbolic language to make the point. And I just want to ask in a general way, did you notice any of that kind of thing? What did you notice? Let me give you an example here. This is actually not from today's reading, but it's just after, so I will not give it away. So this is actually, we're in the mind of the killer, the perpetrator here, and he's kind of like in his house, right, or a cottage, going around and getting something to eat. Doesn't have any food, if you remember. And it says here, but the bread had gone. This is on page 71. The bread had gone stale and was covered with a layer of blue-green mold. But he had a liter of fresh milk and a jar of raspberry jam. He mixed some milk and jam in an old jam jar and tightened the lid before shaking it. When it was well blended and the milk had turned pink, he drank it straight from the jar. It tasted good. For a while, he leaned against the counter, feeling how the sweetened drink gave him strength. That's figurative language, I'm arguing. Why is that figurative language? He's a vampire! Pink milk, come on, you don't just come up with that and say, oh, you just like to put, people like to put sweets in their milk, but, I'm making an argument to you, but that's what I'm talking about. Those little twists or examples that cast a character in a certain way. Did you notice any of that kind of stuff going on? Right, we got Reinhardt and Christina. There's all kinds of little things there that are. I'm using this broad term figurative language to talk about. So choose one of those that you noticed, or talk to someone sitting next to you. Try to come up with one, and then let's make a little inventory of them. And the reason this is a useful question for us, it's going to help us identify some of the themes in the novels. And as we go forward, you'll be able to keep an eye on those themes and develop a more critical reading of the novel. That is, we'll be in dialogue with the novel and see what it's doing. So let's take a few minutes to look for those figures or figurative language and use that to inventory some of the themes in the novel.
Well, no, like skin. Yeah, obviously we said skin. There's some like.
Oh yeah.
I don't know if it's that far, but is you know the killer's purpose you get every time is kissing the kids?
Yeah, it's not that much.
I don't know if that could signify anything.
Kind of.
I mean, I didn't get that one.
Oh yeah, I was laughing when I read that. This is an EverQuest, really? Still playing it? The parts, yeah. Oh yeah.
She's going crazy.
He's just. But.
All right, I hear the noise diminishing here. Let's turn back to the class. So, what did you notice? What did you come up with? Yeah.
And we just noticed a lot of imagery, like everything's just a lot more descriptive in general compared to the last book.
Okay.
Every situation, even when they're just walking through the forest, like everything's described so much more.
Okay. Can you give us one example that you think that just kind of jumped out for you?
I mean, I noticed a lot in the beginning, just their whole walk through the forest was described, like all the trees and all their surroundings were described. Whereas I think in the last book it would have just said like, oh, they're walking through the forest. Like,
Okay. So one thing we can say here about Hannah's comment is that she's arguing there's an emphasis on detail here. And so what's in the details? That's what we're asking. What's we're trying to push on here. Casey? Okay, so we don't have to jump to conclusions here, but just get a bigger picture of what we have here. So forest as organism. Right? It's not an unusual way to think about that, something like that. Kathleen.
So on page 39, the first paragraph, they go through this description of how beautiful Reinhard and Christine's house is, and then the very last sentence of the paragraph is the urge for a child dragged her down like a dead weight in water. So it's kind of like on the outside, maybe their marriage looks fantastic, but on the inside.
Okay, so Reinhard and Christina's marriage dead weight of good. Christine?
Also, near the beginning, when you're in Christina's head at the very beginning, she's walking through the forest, and she describes them like they're set in their ways, they do this all the time, they've been doing it forever and ever, and then eventually she says, oh yeah, and he's only 26. It's like she's talking about as if they were this old couple, this very cute little thing, and that's the end of their life, nothing's going to change. But you realize she's extremely young, and so is he.
Okay, so habit makes the perception of they seem like they're in their 40s or something like that. Perception 50s. Perception of age. This is the dramatic irony, right? Differs from should we say biological reality, right? That they're actually quite young, and yet the way they act toward one another is very grounded in what appear to be habits set in a long time of action. Charlie.
Going off what you just said, the first sentence that introduces Christine and Reinhardt is this couple walked to the woods, but they didn't hold hands because they've been married for so many years.
Uh-huh.
This wasn't a thing that they did. And that sentence like struck me. I'm like, this is awful.
Yeah.
That's
Okay. So
moving.
Let's take a look at it. Is that the
Like the first sentence of chapter 2.
Okay, so let's look at that. They were a couple, but they'd been married for many years and they no longer held hands. So, I mean, on the one hand, that's not figurative language, right? Because it's very descriptive. It is describing their habits. But on the other hand, right, it's a sort of a figure of age, right? They've been married for a long time, and as a result, so in a way, so age, we'll put like time, habit. You could say here like time is an issue in the novel, just to just point out a general thing. Caitlin.
One of the things that I noticed, it actually kind of first makes an appearance at the bottom of page 4 and upper page 5 that comes up between Reinhardt and Christine, is how she's relatively tiny and he kind of towers above her. And they talk about basically, she had suppressed her own views for years because he was so argumentative and opinionated, like right after discussing the kind of the size differences.
Okay.
She's very passive and kind of
Okay,
very
so size is a figure. Size is an image of power, something like that in the relationship. That they're different. The difference in their size sort of stands for a difference in emotional power or something like that. And who sort of who gets his way and who doesn't get her way. Right? He always gets his way. Right? To the point where they just kind of accept that, right? It almost, like, later in that chapter, I think there's these suggestions. She would, in a way, prefer to rekindle some kind of intimacy, but she can't do it, and he seems uninterested, and so she's unable to sort of shift things in her direction. Right? And why does she want to rekindle intimacy? It's not because she's so deeply in love with him, right? But she wants something. She's hoping for something. Right?
Going off of that, they described her as a doll, and like she
Okay, great.
plaything to him, like, and he would control her, and she'd be just a little lady.
Very famous figure, right, in Norwegian literature. Anyone know why? A Dollhouse. Thank you, Ibsen, right? The very famous Norwegian playwright. This is one of the most famous plays he wrote. And it's interesting to think a dollhouse. What kind of figure is that? It's very interesting to think about the history of dolls. Make sense of that title, because when we think of dolls, right? I don't know what you think about, Barbie or something like that, where the figures are plastic and you move them up, you pick them up. I have a lot of dolls in my house, and I just toss them back where they belong. But right, you can work with them and you can put clothes on them and you can do different things with them and so forth, right? Stage different games with them. But at that time that Ibsen wrote that play, the dollhouse was more like almost like an atrium where you took the doll and you put it behind a piece of glass, and it was more like a display, right? And so when you think about that title, this very famous play, A Dollhouse, there's this notion of sort of, it's almost this kind of idea of domestic order where things are put in their place and then, that order can't be disturbed. What kind of doll is she here? What kind of figure is that? Gabrielle?
Well, I think like that, and then that kind of adds to how Reinhardt himself is just depicted as a child. Like he's always sitting down playing his computer games, and like her to him, like she's kind of like another just toy that he has, and he always wants attention, just kind of like children do, and always kind of spacey, and he always wants to be right.
Right, he's got his fancy car that's kind of like one more toy, and his amusement is important to him, right? So that then this is like to make then we see the figure, this, like, looking at the figurative language, that it shows that Reinhardt is kind of a kid in this novel about the murder of children, right? That would be one argument that you could make here for sure.
I'll just add on to that part, like, you know that he takes a picture of, like, the dead body immediately, and that's kind of really immature in the sense that who does that? Also, with the creating life as a third part, like, you know how he just, like, kind of aggressively tells her that he's having friends over, so she needs to kind of set things up.
Okay, so kinds of requests and demands. Let's actually stop here for a second. Talk about that. So we're talking about this character Reinhardt. He takes the photo of the dead body of this boy, and Agnes argued this is kind of a childish thing to do. And let's just take a second to think about that action, since everyone has a phone in their pocket probably. What's wrong? What do you make of that? I was going to say what's wrong with that, but I don't want to even assume that. Is that okay to do? Why or why not? Just take a second to talk to someone sitting next to you, and first of all, there's like the social reality of something like that. Would you do it? Would your friend do it? What would be wrong with that? Would that be okay? Whatever. But then there's also, this is in a novel, right? So it's trying to tell us something about what's going on in the story and about the characters. So try to distinguish between those two levels, and maybe choose one, what you think of the action itself, and then what's it doing in the novel. Let's actually just do it this way. First, the action itself. Take a minute to talk about that, talk about it as a class. Second, what's it doing in the novel? Okay, so go for it, and then let's just take very brief time, but come up with something to say about the photo of the dead body.
I think it's each their own. I'll be honest. It's no different from saying like a car accident. Everybody slows down to see it. See, that's the big one. Here's one thing. If he doesn't do anything and it's that picture, it's like, oh, wait a minute. I kind of get that. That's just everyone's curious, you know. Do it. See, like, it's just curious that you don't see it.
Oh yeah. Okay, let's hear what people say here. This is I mean, obviously it's right at the beginning, and it's like a key thing about this character and the whole introduction of the response to this death. And there's a lot of reflection on it as the novel develops and elaboration of the theme that's in this photo. So what is it? Is that okay? What's going on there? First, just thinking about it as an act. Cassie.
For me, it kind of is like disrespecting the sanctity of life.
Okay.
The kind of community I've been trained.
Okay, so it's taking the sanctity out of life. It's a failure to respect life itself, which is interesting. You know, it is interesting to think about that in our Western visual culture. What are the things you cannot do, right? You know, you can do almost anything, right? We can show the most crazy kinds of pornography, right? Pedophiles. Here we have this kind of stuff. It's against the law, but you know, it's out there, right? Whereas death is the one thing that everyone is scared to show, right? You cannot show death. And they do it now, but it's like one thing that is kind of, it's sort of like beyond the pale in a little bit of a way. And of course part of that is because people have such strong superstitions, notions, feelings about death. But that kind of, the depiction of death, actual real death, right, is a place that visual culture doesn't really go, right? Yeah.
I grew up around little boys, and I just remember them like picking up sticks and like poking dead birds and fish and stuff on the beach, and it being like this just a thing to do as a little boy.
Okay, so it's like this kind of poking at the dead animal, finding out about that dead thing, and taking a picture is a version. It's our digital version of that, poking at that dead object.
And never growing past that either.
Okay.
Like out of that phase.
So almost like a fascination with death. They're never, so then it's depicting him as very child. I mean, so this is evidence of seeing him as childish. To poke at that dead fish, right? Other things, yeah.
Can I be a devil's advocate here?
Yeah.
If I was a policewoman and discovered that scene,
Uh-huh.
and I knew I had to walk 10 or 15 minutes in a public park to make a call, I might take a picture to preserve the evidence of the crime.
Okay.
So that later on, if something was altered while I was
Uh-huh.
gone, I could share it with the police. So it depends on your motive.
So there's three. There's a technical kind of response as well, that perhaps there's a justification in trying to record important evidence, right? Because this is before the police have arrived.
But that's not why you took it.
Motive, right? How do we know what's going on in his head? You have to. That's where the argument goes. This, you see, I want to make it just a side point here. One of the important things here is that you're doing very well. People are doing very well. Is making an argument for why it matters and how it matters. If you just present it as self-evident that you would or wouldn't do that, that's not going to help anyone. But when you make an argument, it's about motive, or it's about a figure that is showing him to be childish because that's the kind of interpretation that this figurative language invites us to engage. Hannah.
We thought it was kind of childish of him because we thought his motive could be to send it to like a newspaper or for publicity because he was so obsessed with like getting on the news and he's asking why the news teams weren't there.
Yeah, there's definitely that suggestion that he himself wants to be the center of attention, and he recognizes that this is a tool, that photo is a tool for him to get attention. Now, we never, well, at least in the part of the novel we've read so far, he doesn't seem to release it right away, other than I think he shows it to his friend or something like that. But it's questionable, like, is it an instrumental kind of choice, right? Is he doing it in order to get something else? And right, I think we can probably all agree that that's not the way to treat the dead, where you use the dead to advance your own notoriety. I mean, obviously it happens, but I think ethically, many people would argue that kind of reverence for the dead or for life would, prescribe us from seeking to exploit or profit from death. Other thoughts? Yeah, Austin.
I think just it's atypical of him compared to like a lot of other when they are like watching them like the Law and Order and Bones and things like that. So the person who finds the dead body freaks out, runs, calls the police, and stays away. They don't ever want to see that again. Because he wants to hang out and take pictures. The action is very atypical.
Okay, so it's sort of a genre violation in a way that we're kind of verging into literary here. That's fine. That it's so unusual, right? The person who finds the body is supposed to freak out, but he's calculating. So yeah, we can argue that tells us about the character. Yeah. Horrible, Sarah.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, and I was gonna say too that like I think he knows it's wrong too. Because then when Christine asks him later, he gets really defensive and is like, "Well, it doesn't matter," and when you were freaking out and all this, he kind of plays off. I think even he realizes that's not inappropriate or okay thing to do, but he kind of just uses it to fill his own like sensationalist, I guess, needs and things like that.
So he knows it's wrong. There's these things, right, where the moral law is clear to all, right? That you don't do that. You don't need to explain that. You don't do that to the dead, right? You respect the dead. And he does it. And so it's just a violation on like a visceral level. Right?
My name's Kate. I thought what was interesting is that was like the point that pushed his wife over the edge. And like she finally stood up to him. She let a lot of things like slide in her head that you could see that she was thinking. But that made her, like, for me as a reader, a lot more credible to me and like gained a lot of respect for her, and that she would like stand up to him when it mattered.
Mm-hmm. So it's also a device in a way that measures her. That she's like a person who has a hard time sort of standing up to him, and yet this is one that goes so far. Okay, so let's just take 30 seconds, and what does this mean for the novel? What does this mean for the novel? We've already had a couple points there, but if you can push it a little bit further, or just make a concise point about how does this matter for the novel, for the character, whatever.
That's my hypothesis. He's gonna be the next weird kid. I know, right? That's what it seems like, though, right? He's like a little kid. He's a little kid. He's very like, oh, kid, man. I'm telling you, dude. Like, in the future, his wife's gonna leave, right? He's gonna leave. He's gonna go crazy. Put it out on little kids. That would be such a fucking turn. You already know. That's my hypothesis. If it happens, though, you're gonna have to give me a fist bump with an explosion.
Okay, 30 seconds up. So what's it doing here? How does it work in the novel? That's the next question. Anyone?
We were just talking about how it's like kind of comparing it to a violation of the child theme, and all that. Like you have the villain who's doing these things because he has these urges and doesn't want to do them. It's contrasting with Reinhardt, who is kind of violating death to his child.
Okay, so this is interesting. It's a parallelism between the action of the killer and Reinhardt.
And he's not doing anything illegal.
Right. So he doesn't do anything illegal, but he crosses a moral boundary, whereas the killer is sort of consumed with self-control and yet has this sort of violation that's a strong moral and legal violation. But there's a parallelism there that makes us think about those legal and moral lines. Great point. Gabrielle.
So I was just thinking, like, the photo captures the lifelessness of the child, which is kind of like what is in the relationship between him and his wife.
Okay.
Like, there is no live child between them.
Okay.
Something his wife really wants, and he's, like, obsessive over.
Okay, so a great point about that capturing the death of the child in a way is a figure for the death that's in their relationship. Right? Their relationship is dead. He's obsessed with death. Right? In a way, he's the source of the death in the relationship. The other thing is like photography used to be thought of as death, right? Because you take the photo and you have a substitute for the living in the photo. And there's people might probably heard there's like many people have superstitions about photography, right? That it takes the soul or whatever. That you can think about photography in that way, and so the death and photography kind of go together. Of course, this is digital, which isn't it's a little bit different there, but nevertheless, you can think about that theme. Jennifer.
I just thought of this, but I think it's kind of ironic how he's not interested in having a child with Christine, but the fact that he's gotten so wrapped up and so interested about a dead child itself. The irony of like the life and death concept. Great way to put it. He's obsessed with the dead child, but doesn't want a living child, right? And so there's a real strong ironic contrast there in the novel. The novel begins with life and death, right? Other thoughts? These are great observations, great arguments. Other ones that people came up with. Okay, we'll take the last little bit more than 5 minutes here. You can think about it some more, but I think that's a place where you can see some of the main lines in the novel get started. But that's the final question that I wanted to ask is, based on the opening of the novel, what would you argue are the themes that are getting developed? By themes, I mean a repetition. That's what a theme really is a repetition of some of that figurative language we've been talking about, a repetition of a character's thoughts, things like that tell us about what the issues are in the novel. So let's just take about a minute to talk about that, and then we'll hear what people have to say. But what would you argue are one or two, or just focus on one, what would you argue is a main theme in the novel? Not the main theme, but a main theme in the novel as we've read it so far. Let's take a minute to do that, and we'll talk about it as a class.
Well, see, I think I know general things, but I think women qualities is a big one. It's like right? I don't know how much it gets into it. When you start reading, it starts to focus a lot. Right up and like you get a lot of attention between those two things. Like social influences,
I think that's one.
Okay, let's hear what you had to say. So, Charlie, thank you for getting us started. All right, we have 5 minutes left, so let's hear what's up. Charlie.
There's this theme of control, like in the Reese's relationship, how Reinhardt is controlling Christine and how Christine can't like fight that back.
Okay, so there's this really strong emphasis on the power control dynamics in the relationship between Reinhardt and Christina. So that's in that relationship. We can ask, like, what's going to happen with it? How does control within a relationship relate to the broader issues in the novel? Did you have a thought about that you wanted to add? Or?
There's another aspect of control. The man in the blue anorak controlling himself and his like wishes or desires. So there's that
good point. Yeah. So
interpersonal control and then within himself control.
Okay, so we'll put interpersonal, self-control. Great start. Okay, other themes. Yeah, Christine.
It's also about like the psychological and societal causes of deviant behavior in general. Like the detectives are talking to each other constantly. Like, how did this happen? Why did this happen? What are some scenarios that could lead to this happening? And it's always about could we have helped them more? When did this start? Kind of thing. How can we even help?
Is that right? What could have prevented this? So both cause, thinking about what's the source of this, where does it come from, but also what could have prevented it? Is there some way that this could have been stopped? Excellent. Other ones people thought of. Okay. Parents and children. And of course, that's like our, what would you call it? To put it in a fancy way, post-Freudian legacy, right? What did Freud say? That the nuclear family nurtures and destroys, right? It gives you these things that you want to kill your father or, whatever. And this is, in that way, the relationships of your parents and children arguably here shape future behaviors, and then, of course, these are deviant behaviors and destructive behaviors that have a consequence on others' lives, and so we go back to those family relationships to understand them. The novel certainly plays along those lines, so we can think of parents and children as a big theme here. And of course, the novel's about children in a way, so that's very strongly present. Other ones, other themes. Great start, yeah. Elizabeth.
Yeah. I think that gender roles are also really important in this. I see a lot in like the Christina and Reinhardt relationship, where he would say things like, "Oh, this is hard for you because you're a woman," or like, "I'm taking pictures because it makes me look really strong." Just like things like that.
Okay, so there's a very sort of conventional kind of gender thinking in that relationship that then reflects off other things going on in the novel. Great. So here's some things to think about as you go ahead in the reading. And next time we'll talk more specifically about the child, and that's one of the key words for next time. So see you on Thursday.
Pass that on.